It began innocently, just a regular Monday morning. I can still remember that brisk, predictable start to the day. She hurried out the door, coffee in one hand, her bag in the other, tossing a quick wave over her shoulder with a half smile. She was always a bit rushed like that, teetering on the edge of being late, but somehow managing to make it on time. I didn't think much of it. It was just life as usual. We'd been married for a few years by then, and our routine was like an old comfortable pair of shoes. But then things began to shift, slowly at first, like the first hints of fog creeping in before a full-blown storm. She started working late more often, which wasn't unusual by itself. She was driven, dedicated. I admired that about her, but it was different now. She'd come home after these long shifts, looking hollow. I'd ask her about her day, hoping for some detail, some familiar sign of our old connection, but her answers would be short, distant, like she was 1,000 miles away. "Just a busy day," she'd say, flashing a tired smile before disappearing upstairs to shower. And every night, it was the same pattern. The long hours, the vacant answers, the long hot showers that I'd listen to from the bedroom, the sound of water masking whatever thought she might be hiding. I wanted to think it was just stress from work, that maybe she was going through something she didn't know how to talk about. I wanted to be supportive, give her space. But that creeping sense of something wrong refused to settle. I tried to shake it, to tell myself I was imagining things. But the late nights continued, and my doubts grew louder. There was one night in particular that stuck with me, when she mentioned helping some older people at work. It struck me as odd, because she'd never mentioned working with elderly clients before. I remember pausing, caught off guard by the sudden specificity, and asking her what she meant by it. She brushed it off, told me it wasn't a big deal, but there was something about her tone, too casual, too practiced, that made me wonder if she'd prepared this line in advance. It felt rehearsed, like she was already 2 steps ahead, anticipating my questions, ready with answers just believable enough to keep me from pressing further. So, I let it go. I told myself that sometimes we don't share every detail of our lives. After all, she'd never given me any reason to doubt her before. But after that night, every late shift she worked felt heavier. I'd sit at the kitchen table, watching the clock, counting down the hours until she'd finally come through the door. Each time she was a little later, her answers a little more clipped. I couldn't escape the feeling that she was slipping further away, bit by bit, night after night, leaving only fragments of herself behind for me to grasp onto. One evening, I thought maybe I was being paranoid, letting my imagination get the better of me. So I decided to do a small experiment, just to put my mind at ease. I'd wait by the window when she left for work, just to catch a glimpse of her heading down the street, to see if anything looked off. It was a quiet street, and most people were already home by then, so her footsteps seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. She walked briskly, her head down, as if she was avoiding eye contact with anyone who might be watching. That was when I noticed she'd started glancing over her shoulder. At first, I thought she'd seen me watching her, but no, she was just looking around, in this odd, furtive way, like someone checking if they were being followed. I brushed it off, told myself I was reading too much into things, but that image stayed with me, her figure slipping into the darkness, shoulders tense, glancing around as though she had something to hide. The strange thing was, on certain nights when she'd come home after one of these long shifts, she seemed lighter somehow, almost relieved. There was a strange energy about her, not like exhaustion, but rather an emptiness, the kind that comes after some intense, secret experience. It was subtle, just a shift in her expression, a relaxed smile that felt a bit too casual, like she'd found something else to care about, something outside of us. I kept telling myself that I was imagining things, but as the weeks turned into months, it was harder to ignore. The silence between us grew heavier, each night stretching longer, each excuse sounding a little more hollow. I'd wait up for her, a glass of water sweating on the table beside me, hoping she'd give me something, anything, that would make me feel like she was still here, still my wife. But each night, all I got was a quick, distracted kiss on the cheek, the smell of shampoo lingering in the air as she disappeared upstairs. I tried to shake it off, to focus on the life we'd built together, the years we'd spent laughing, planning, dreaming. But there was something in her absence that I couldn't ignore, like an invisible weight pressing down on me, reminding me of the distance between us. It was as though she'd taken a part of herself away and left a shadow in its place. By the end of that first year, I'd become an expert at waiting, at counting the minutes, at listening for the sound of her key in the door, only to watch her slip past me, eyes averted, too tired, too busy, too caught up in a life that no longer included me. And as much as I tried to hold on to the trust we'd once had, to tell myself she was still the person I'd married, I couldn't help but feel like I was losing her to something I couldn't see. All I was left with were the silent nights, the empty spaces between us, and a feeling that something precious had slipped through my fingers. By the time a year had passed, I'd become something of an expert at holding my breath. Every night she was gone stretched into an endless waiting game, one I played in silence. I'd stay up later than usual, lying in the dark, listening to the sounds of the house, the ticking of the clock, the occasional creak of the floorboards, the hum of the fridge. I'd watch the minutes crawl by, sometimes dozing off, only to jolt awake at the sound of her key in the lock. And when she'd slip through the door in the early hours, her face would be drained, her eyes glossed over. The woman I'd known, my wife, was still there physically, but she was absent in every other way that mattered. A stranger wearing her face, murmuring a vague good night, before slipping upstairs without so much as a glance in my direction. The thought of confronting her gnawed at me nightly. But each time I tried, the words died in my throat, stuck somewhere between anger and a kind of desperate fear. What if I was wrong? What if this really was just a phase, some temporary rut she'd fallen into, and I was the paranoid husband reading too much into it all? But then one night, I broke. It was a Tuesday, early spring, with rain coming down in sheets outside the window. She'd left for work that morning, giving me her usual distracted wave, but something had been different that day. She'd left her phone on the kitchen counter, forgotten in her rush. When I noticed it, I thought about texting her to let her know, but then I paused. What if this was my chance? What if this was the one moment I'd been waiting for to see the truth? I unlocked her phone with hands that shook, my mind racing with 1,000 excuses for why I was doing this. Just a quick look, I told myself, just to set my mind at ease. I opened her messages, expecting to see nothing out of the ordinary, a simple trail of work conversations. But my heart froze when I saw a name I didn't recognize, someone she'd been messaging frequently, late at night, even in the early hours of the morning. The messages were cryptic, just short exchanges here and there, but they were enough to tell me that whoever this person was, they weren't a coworker. The words were familiar, even affectionate in a way that turned my stomach. It was a mix of subtle flirtation and planning, as though they were arranging stolen moments, coordinating schedules, meeting places. And it was clear that they were meeting late, after hours, far from prying eyes. The truth hit me like a sledgehammer. The weight of it settled in my chest, dasio, heavy and unmovable, suffocating. I stared at her phone, reading the messages over and over, my mind refusing to accept the words right in front of me. 2 years. 2 years of excuses, lies, disappearing acts. 2 years of slipping out of our life to meet someone else. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her with someone else. Her face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in ages. The realization was bitter, gut-wrenching, and I felt my heart harden with a kind of rage I hadn't known was inside me. I had to know more. I had to see it with my own eyes, to confront the reality head on. So the next night, I made a plan. Around midnight, I left the house, slipping out as quietly as possible. The rain from the day before had stopped, leaving a chill in the air. I could feel my pulse pounding as I walked down the empty street, a mix of anger and dread propelling me forward. I made my way to her workplace, my mind racing with questions and suspicions I hadn't dared to voice. I waited there, hidden behind a parked car, watching the empty building, watching for any sign of her, any light, any movement that would prove me wrong. But as the hours passed, my worst fears solidified. She wasn't there. There were no lights, no sounds, no trace of her at all. I stood there, a cold knot forming in my stomach, watching the empty parking lot, feeling the chill seep into my bones. I don't know how long I waited. Minutes? Hours? It all blurred together in a fog of dread. I watched the building as though expecting her to appear out of nowhere, to prove that I'd been wrong, that she was really working late like she'd said. But the truth was undeniable. She wasn't working late. She was somewhere else. On my way back home, I felt a numbness settle over me, a strange calm that almost frightened me. I wasn't angry, not in the way I thought I'd be. It was more like a hollow acceptance, a realization that the person I'd loved and trusted all these years had been slipping away right in front of me. And I had let it happen. I'd been so caught up in hoping for the best, in trusting her, that I'd ignored every sign, every whisper of doubt. When I finally got back, I sat in the dark, waiting for her. I didn't know what I was going to say or how I was going to confront her. All I knew was that this charade was over. The lies, the secrets, the distance, none of it would continue. I'd waited long enough. She came in around 4 a.m., her step soft, careful, as though she was trying not to wake me. I listened as she slipped off her shoes, her keys jangling quietly as she tried to keep them from making a sound. I could hear the rustle of her bag as she hung it up, the slight catch in her breath, as if she was almost nervous. It was like watching a scene from a movie, one I'd seen 1,000 times but never truly understood until that moment. I was sitting at the kitchen table when she walked in, her face a mixture of surprise and something else, something like guilt, though she tried to hide it behind a quick, forced smile. "Oh, you're up," she said, her voice light, casual, as though this was just another night, another late shift. "Where were you?" I asked, keeping my tone steady, controlled. She looked at me, her eyes flickering, as though searching for an answer that wouldn't betray her. "I told you, I was working late," she replied, her voice a little too calm, too rehearsed. But I'd had enough of the lies, enough of the charade. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time I saw her for who she was, a stranger, someone I no longer recognized, someone who had chosen someone else over me. "No, you weren't," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I was there. I waited. You weren't there." Her face paled, the facade slipping, her mouth opening and closing as she searched for words, for a way out. But there was nothing left to say. I could see it in her eyes, the way they dropped, the guilt she couldn't hide any longer. And in that silence, the truth settled between us, heavy and unbreakable. She knew she was caught, and I knew I'd lost her. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating, as she stared back at me, her mouth opening and closing, in a wordless attempt to find something, anything, that could explain away the truth. But we both knew there was no story she could spin, no excuse that could erase the months of lies, the late nights, the messages I'd seen. She knew I'd caught her, and for the first time she looked at me with a mix of guilt and resignation. It was like a mask had fallen, and all the effort to keep up the act had finally crumbled. I leaned back in my chair, feeling a strange calm wash over me, a quiet resolve that steadied my voice even though my hands were trembling. "I need you to tell me the truth," I said, my voice firm but low. "Just once. No more stories, no more lies. Just tell me, where have you been?" She looked down at her hands, fidgeting, avoiding my gaze. I could see the inner battle raging behind her eyes, the urge to deny it, to make up one last story. But the weight of her secrets was too much. Her shoulders slumped, and I saw the fight go out of her. She let out a slow breath, her face falling as she whispered, I was with him. The admission hung in the air, each word sinking like a stone into the hollow pit of my stomach. I'd known it, deep down. I'd known it for a long time, even if I hadn't wanted to believe it. But hearing her say it, in her own voice, it was like a knife twisting in my chest, an ache that was both familiar and unbearable. How long? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, though it felt like shouting in the stillness of the kitchen. She hesitated, glancing up at me before looking away, shame clouding her eyes. It's been 2 years, she said, her voice shaking. I didn't plan for it to happen. It just did. 2 years. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me, the weight of her confession hitting me like a tidal wave. 2 years of my life, 2 years of her sneaking around, lying to my face, all while I'd been at home waiting, trusting, believing in the person I thought she was. I felt like a fool, like I'd been blind to everything, clinging to a version of her that hadn't existed in a long time. I took a deep breath, trying to hold back the flood of anger and hurt that threatened to spill out. So, all those nights you were working late? You were with him? She nodded, barely able to meet my gaze. Yes, she whispered, her voice breaking. It wasn't supposed to be this way. I didn't want to hurt you. That last line hit me harder than I expected, an almost absurd irony that would have been laughable if it weren't so painful. Didn't want to hurt me? For 2 years, she'd been slipping away, meeting someone else in the dark, and yet somehow she still thought of herself as the victim, as if she'd somehow managed to justify it in her mind. And maybe she had. Maybe, somewhere along the way, she'd convinced herself that she was just lonely, that this other man was something she needed, something I couldn't give her. So, who is he? I asked, the words cutting through the silence like a blade. Is he someone from work? Someone I know? She hesitated, and I could see her debating whether to tell me, whether to reveal the full truth, or keep me in the dark about that too. But eventually, she sighed, the last of her defenses crumbling as she mumbled, Yes, he's someone from work, a client. A client. I felt a fresh wave of anger wash over me, all those excuses about helping older clients, all those nights she'd brushed off my questions with vague explanations. It had all been a cover, a convenient story to hide what she'd really been doing. I wanted to scream, to shout, to demand answers to questions I didn't even know how to ask. Instead, I just stared at her, feeling a numbness settle over me, a hollow ache that seemed to press down on my chest. So that's it? I asked quietly. 2 years, and you never thought to tell me? You never thought to stop? She looked down, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. I wanted to. So many times I wanted to. But every time I'd think about what it would do to you. And I couldn't bring myself to hurt you like that. I let out a bitter laugh, a sound that seemed to echo in the silence. Well, congratulations, I said, my voice laced with sarcasm. You didn't want to hurt me, but here we are. She flinched at that, the truth of my words settling over her like a shroud. There was no going back from this, no easy fix, no simple apology that could erase what she'd done. We were standing on the edge of a chasm, one that had been growing wider and deeper for 2 years, and there was no bridge left to cross it. What happens now? She asked, her voice trembling, her eyes pleading with me for some kind of answer. I took a long, slow breath, the weight of her betrayal pressing down on me, leaving me feeling drained and empty. I thought back to all the nights I'd spent waiting for her, the questions I'd buried, the trust I'd clung to despite everything, and I realized with a painful clarity that the person I'd loved, the person I'd trusted, was gone. She'd made her choice, and there was nothing left for me to hold on to. "I don't know," I said, my voice low and weary. "I don't know what happens next, but I know I can't. I can't keep doing this. I can't pretend that everything's fine, that we're still us." She looked down, her face etched with guilt, regret, shame, all the things she should have felt long ago, when it still might have mattered. But now it was too little, too late. I could feel myself letting go, the anger and hurt giving way to a kind of quiet acceptance. This was the end, and we both knew it. I think you need to leave," I said finally, the words heavy but certain. "I can't have you here, not after this." She nodded, a single tear sliding down her cheek as she stood up, gathering her things. For a brief moment, I felt a pang of sadness, a bittersweet ache for everything we'd once had, for the life we'd built together, the dreams we'd shared. But that life was gone now, and the woman standing in front of me was a stranger, someone I no longer recognized. As she walked out the door, the silence settled over me, deep and unbroken, a stillness that felt both painful and liberating. I sat there for a long time, staring into the darkness, feeling the weight of her absence, the empty space where she'd once been. And in that silence, I realized that I'd been holding on to a ghost, a memory of someone who no longer existed. The truth was painful, raw, but in that moment, I knew it was better than the lie I'd been living. And as I sat there, alone in the dark, I felt a strange sense of peace, a quiet strength rising up within me. This was the end of one chapter, yes, but it was also the beginning of something new, and this time I'd be walking forward alone,